Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two just to get everybody into the Zoom and everyone's getting settled in, and then we'll go ahead and get started with tonight's event. So just hang tight real quick. And I also want to give a big happy Nowruz to everyone. Eid Shama Mubarak. We're still in Nowruz season. Spring is just now starting. I'm here in LA and the weather is starting to get really nice and warm, which is super nice.
I thought it was always nice and warm.
For some reason, in the past few weeks, the nights just get really, really chilly, and I'm just not a fan of that. But the nights are starting, except for last night. Last night was pretty cold, but the nights are now starting to warm up a little bit, which is really comforting.
Yeah, and then that random rain the other day, what was that about?
So weird, like a full-on storm.
Wow, it gets cold to like what, the 60s?
Yeah, that's like freezing.
Basically,
oh my
yeah.
gosh, we have to wear jackets and boots. Stop. Anything below like 75, I put on my Uggs for. So.
Wow.
For people just now joining the Zoom, we're just going to wait a minute or two just to make sure that everybody who's gotten their alerts are going to go ahead and join, and then we'll get started with the book talk.
Hi, Jessie. Thanks for joining us. And for starting the chat.
Okay, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Lily, and I'm going to be kind of starting off the night for us. So tonight we have a very special event that I personally am so excited about. We're joined tonight by Yasmine Mahdavi. She's an Iranian-American author who wrote Roots in Iran, Stories of Visionary Women. This book is a collection of 15 remarkable women and their stories about their roots in Iran. In the book, each of these stories are accompanied with artwork by female artists who also have Middle Eastern roots. As we all know, March is Women's History Month. For the past few weeks, NIAC LA leadership team has curated a collection of historically significant Iranian women within politics, the arts, scientists, and much more. These women were highlighted on our social media as a way to celebrate their accomplishments and contributions. To wrap up such a wonderful month, tonight's event is moderated by one of NIAC LA's leadership team members, Dr. Shadi Seyedyousef. As we go through this hour learning more about Yasmine and the amazing stories she has published for everyone to read. So a little bit about our moderator for tonight. Dr. Shadi Seyedyousef goes by she, her pronouns. She's an Iranian immigrant, educator, and activist based in LA. She came to the United States at the age of 3 after being diagnosed with severe juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. She's been teaching for more than 10 years, finding particularly a lot of joy in teaching young children how to read. She recently founded Love and Liberation Education Consulting LLC, focused on doing the work of creating a better world for all through radical hope, revolutionary love, joyful resistance, and critical praxis. You can find her on Instagram at dr.shadella and at love.andliberation.ed or at her website, www.loveandliberationed.com. And those links are dropped in the chat for everyone to access. You can also check out her Etsy shop for social justice inspired swag, so many cute stickers and everything like that. I love her shop, which is etsy.com/shop/loveandliberationed. And that's also going to be dropped in the chat as well. So now I'll pass it over to Shadi and Yasmine to get the night started.
Thank you.
Hooray! Thank you so much, Lily, for introducing us. And Yasmin, I am so excited to be here with you. Sorry, I went off camera because I left my book on my bed. So happy Women's Her Story Month to you. I hope you had a wonderful March, Nowruz time, and Women's Her Story Month. What a beautiful month, right? So congratulations on publishing your book. So beautiful, so exciting. This book, Roots in Iran, all about visionary women and all about like really badass people is what I think. So since some in our community may not yet be familiar with your book, can you give us a little bit of a brief introduction about your own background as well as this book and why you decided to write it?
Thank you so much. And Eid Nowruz Shema Mubarak. So as was mentioned, my name is Yasmine Mahdavi. I was born and raised in Iran, and I left Iran when I was 12 years old with my parents, and we all moved with my sister to California, to Southern California in Orange County. That was many, many moons ago. I now live in New York City, and I've lived here for, I think New York I've lived in the longest I've ever lived anywhere, more than 20 years. I came across the book, I should tell you, is about 15 trailblazing women who were either born and raised in Iran like I was, or had parents who were born and raised in Iran. And what I think is fascinating about them is that they are all diverse. They come from different backgrounds. One was a mathematician, one is an astronaut, one's an entrepreneur, scientist, activist, athletes. They're all in there. And I think what is amazing about them is that they all have this similar experience of having roots in Iran and having experienced challenges and obstacles and persevering. So that's the genesis or the summary of the book.
Yeah, and I love how you chose to write it specifically for like young adults, right? Like what made you decide to go that route as opposed to like for a fully adult audience?
Yeah, excellent question. I wrote the book for a younger audience because for many reasons. One, I wanted to write it to my 12-year-old self when I came to Iran, and I had really no role models, and there were many people that had similar experiences as me. And I also wanted it, and as my children were getting to be the age that I was when I first came to this country, I wanted to share with them what my life was like around the same age they were. Yeah. So the book was really geared for my 12-year-old self and my 12-year-old children. And I wanted to speak to that younger person language so that I could share those experiences. So that's how it ended up becoming a young adult or middle grade book.
That is so awesome. Yeah, I can imagine having a book like this when I was in middle school. That would have been so revolutionary. And I'm so glad that like a new generation of young Iranian Americans and even just girls, all girls, right? All people have access to read about all of these dynamite folks. So what vision really inspired you to write this book, and how did you decide which women to choose?
So the one event that was really triggering for me or really important was when Maryam Mirzakhani died. And for those folks who don't know who Maryam Mirzakhani was, she was a mathematician, and she is the only woman who's ever won the Fields Medal, which is the highest prize in mathematics. So when she died in 2017, and I was telling her story to my children, I became really intrigued about who could be other women who had similar experiences as me, who grew up in Iran, who were born and raised in Iran, and who managed to persevere and succeed beyond our wildest imaginations, despite the obstacles that would have been before them. So it set me on this really intriguing path of curiosity of who are these other people, and can I share their stories? And I want to know who they are so I can share them with my children. And as I was thinking about like, well, am I going to tell just my children these stories? And why wouldn't other people want to be interested in this idea? That's how the book started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So as you were writing and doing research for this book, how can you tell us a little bit about that research process? Like, did you get to talk to the any of the women, or like how did you go about getting their stories?
Yeah, so the research process is interesting because when I first came up with the idea, I was having dinner actually in Long Beach at a Cambodian restaurant with one of my friends.
Representing, I was in Long Beach.
Yeah. So I was talking to her about this idea that I had about this book, and she said, "Well, how long do you think it's going to take you to do this?" And I said, "Oh, well, it can't be more than 2 years." And of course, it took 4 years to do the research and writing.
That's a long time. That's a really
long time, and I didn't expect that. But I also, well, none of us expected a pandemic to happen either, and it happened. The reading and the writing and the research and the editing, all of that stuff also happened during the pandemic. And in a way, the stillness of life during the pandemic allowed me uninterrupted time to do more research and writing. So I used that also to my advantage. That was one of the reasons why it took a long time. Not only did the world stop in the context of the publishing world, but it also allowed me to have some quiet time and to read and write and read again and write more.
Yeah.
So that's how it all took place. And then I think you asked me, how did I come up with the women?
Yeah.
So that's really interesting because I had no idea how I was going to structure the book or who was going to be in the book. And I had to really think back about my own experiences and what do I want people to take away from the book. So I backed into how that was going to fuel the subjects or the subject selection. And I anchored the revolution and my experience about having grown up around the revolution and during the war as the place and time that was going to affect how these women were going to live their lives. So that event was going to be what was going to propel them in different directions. So that's how I used the women. And then I also, in 2017 is when the book idea came about. I was also really thinking about immigrant experiences. So then the second layer after being a woman with roots in Iran, I wanted them to also be immigrants, not living in Iran, having been shaped by outside of Iran. And so that was the second layer or the third layer that I wanted to add on in terms of who was going to be in the book.
Yeah, because that's a totally different experience, being like an Iranian hyphenated person rather than like that's so interesting. I love it.
Like some of us left Iran when we were really little. We were very young, and some of us had to leave Iran because we didn't have a choice. Some of us go back and forth. So there were many layers of the hyphenated, and experiences that I was hoping to capture.
Yeah, and I think you did a great job of doing that, and also of talking about so many different folks across like the spectrum of, not just focusing on one layer of like what it means to be an Iranian American or Iranian anything woman, but like all different avenues, which I really appreciate. I know that like we often get kind of like pushed into certain subcategories of like things that our families or whoever expect us to do, but I love how there's like athletes and astronauts and like all these different kinds of passions that people have, that really shows how Iranian women are multifaceted and just like everybody else, we have lots of different passions. So that's really cool. So I want to switch gears a little bit. Your background is more in quantitative and like math and finance and things like that, right? So how was this experience for you, thinking more qualitatively, like more in a narrative form, as you were writing this story or these stories?
So I started with a lot of self-doubt, just as, was I going to be a good enough writer? What did I know about writing? How was I going to weave a compelling story that was going to reach an audience? Who was going to be interested in me? How can I had to learn about all the rules for nonfiction, right? Because one of the things I thought about was, well, maybe I can pepper in made up dialogue. And then I realized really quickly, no, if it's nonfiction, it stays nonfiction. You can't make up anything. So I had to learn how to be an excellent writer. And I took many, many classes. I had several writing critique groups. I had editors. I went to the drawing board many, many times. The manuscript has been rewritten like 20 times. And that's not including the smaller sentences that were removed and replaced, like the verbs that were replaced and all the sentences that needed to be tightened and restructured. So it was quite a process of figuring out how I was going to do something. But I bring it back to how the women in the book kind of inspired me also. They too did things that seemed outlandish, seemed outrageous, seemed off the cuff, seemed maybe like impossible to do. And they persevered, and their tenacity fueled my energy also, because I thought, well, how can I write about them and not be inspired by what they did, even though they did it in so many different facets. So that propelled me, and that kept me on my toes and kept me curious and engaged in the process.
I love that. Yeah, we see lots of books about phenomenal women of different cultures, but this is like the first that I've at least seen that's focused on Iranian women or folks with like Iranian roots, which is really cool. So I would say you're a visionary woman in that sense then. So that's amazing. So how did you decide what snippets? Because if you look through the book, there's all of these wonderful life stories of folks, but then all throughout, there's also like, let's talk about the war between Iran and Iraq, or let me introduce you to Nowruz. How did you decide how to incorporate those pieces of like Iranian culture and those elements in the book?
Yeah, that's
fair to weave them in.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, actually. And I'm glad you brought up those examples too. So for folks who haven't seen the book, so there is a chapter on Esmaeilzadeh, here she is. And her story is, she, of course, is a phenomenal woman, and she was born and raised in Iran, and she lived in Iran during the Iran and Iraq War. But I didn't know, or there wasn't a great way to talk about the Iran and Iraq War and give a summary to the readers who weren't going to be familiar with it. And I thought this book had a great opportunity to teach people about Iranian history and culture and put Iran in a context, in a full context. So I created these snippets or sidebars in the book. So Iran and Iraq War is one of them. So to give more background to the reader and hope that inspires more curiosity and they will pick up more information. The how to learn about Nowruz came from Jasmin Moghbeli, who is an Iranian American astronaut, and she celebrates Nowruz. But I didn't know how to explain Nowruz to people in the narrative form, so I created the sidebar to explain what Nowruz is and the half scene and what we celebrate.
That's so cool. So you're getting a little mix of both, like learning about these cool women and also like learning about Iranian culture, which I love.
Definitely, yeah. It was a way to weave all of that in. It wouldn't have been truly authentic if I didn't put those important pieces of information in, but I didn't know how to weave them into a story. It was a learning experience from just reading a ton of children's books and how other authors have done that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I can see that too, from also teaching little kids and reading.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So there's so many wonderful illustrations, and they're all so different. So you can see like each image of these women is radically like different from the next. So how did you choose who to work with in terms of like your illustrators and things like that?
Yeah, so I'm so happy you asked me about the illustrators because I love working with all of them. I ended up putting an ad out for illustrators. I wanted women who had roots in the Middle East because I thought it would be really interesting to have a female perspective with a Middle Eastern twist on how the illustrations were going to come out. And I put an ad out. I did lots of interviews with many capable women. And I ended up hiring 7 women, all of whom had roots in the Middle East. One of them is Iranian, British, and the rest of them are Arab women. And I think at the time, most of them were living in the Middle East when we were working together on the artwork. So the reason why you see so many different variations or different perspectives and interpretations is because they're all different artists. And it was one of the things that I had promised myself, that I wanted to showcase other people's work. And this was the best way I could do it. And it ended up becoming really challenging from an art perspective standpoint, and about making sure that the sizes and the fonts fit and the formatting worked well. And it also was challenging because I was working across time zones in totally different countries, and many of my illustrators were living in Lebanon when the Beirut blast went off. Yeah. And so thankfully none of them were hurt during the blast, but that blast took them out of work for weeks. So our work got delayed substantially and unexpectedly because of it. So if you ask me, would I do it again? Of course I would do it again. And I would recommend anybody who goes on these creative ventures to look outside of the box and incorporate other voices as much as they can in their creative works.
I love that. Someone asked in the Q&A if we could show some of the images. Is that okay?
Oh, of course. Yes.
Here's, I'll just share some of my favorites.
That's
and I love that the chessboard that was included there too. And then there's Melody Son.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see like just like really radically like different styles for each of the.
Yeah. And if anybody is also more interested in knowing who the artists are, of course they're noted in the cover of the book, but I give explicit credit on the work that they did inside the book, so you can see there's Mayam, there's Ahani.
So beautiful. This one's cool. It's like over words. I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's Yasmine. I think it's really interesting. It was really fun to go through the different iterations of how the work was coming together with the artist, because I'm not an artist, and it was really it was fun to see their creative process. Yeah.
I love it. So cool. So what is your vision for how educators like myself could use a book like this?
So I hope, and I think the book can be used in a variety of different curricula. I think it could be used in history, in literature, in social studies, in general studies. So I'm hoping that teachers and educators will use that in the different forms. I also have the discussion questions and thought questions at the end of the book to inspire educators in further conversation. Yeah. And if you go to my website, I've linked these questions to common core curricula and standards. Mm-hmm. So teachers and educators can easily map out how to use them.
So brilliant.
So I tried to make it as easy as possible to be used.
Incredibly user-friendly. I love that so much, because the last thing that educators want to do is figure out what standards are aligned to each thing they're working on. So that is so helpful. We really, really appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. And I have to give homage to all educators, whether they're in the room or not. It's been I applaud the hard work you do, and I'm hoping that I've made it just a little bit easier by putting those standards in.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. So what advice would you give to aspiring writers? And I know that you self-published this book, is that correct? Yeah. So tell us a little bit about if you were going to tell yourself some advice before you started this book, or anyone else, what would you say to those folks who are thinking about it? They have an inkling of an idea, they're not sure what to do with it.
Yeah, so my advice for people who want to write is get started and write, because it's a lot harder than it sounds, right? The act of sitting down and writing can become really difficult, and it can become uninspiring. You're going to hit roadblocks and that are going to impede you. So start writing about things that you are passionate about, because that will anchor you and motivate you to get to the writing table. The other piece of advice I would give is create a schedule of writing. Create a disciplined action plan or a habit that will help you write. Say, if it's 6 o'clock in the morning, then 6 o'clock to 6:15, write, or just, do as you set out a timeline to make sure that you get the work done.
Yeah.
The other thing that I would also say, and it might be a little unorthodox, is start to read as a writer. Whatever information you're reading, think about it from a critical or a critiquing eye, and think about how you would hone or master a sentence, just to improve your own thinking and your own skills. Writing, I don't think anybody ever masters. I don't think anybody becomes the best they can be. It's a skill that you always improve upon. And so being more disciplined and a deeper thinker, all of those things help you become a better writer and expressing yourself. So write and make it a habit to write, and read, but read as a writer would, and be diverse in your reading. I think that's something else that I would recommend. I have children, so I would read a lot of young children's books, and I've been reading, a variety. But I also read just a lot of nonfiction and fiction and classics and magazines. I love the New Yorker that my dad hooked me on. So I read a variety of great writing, but I don't read it just to consume it. I read it to become a better writer and to have information and to become better skilled.
Yeah. And you can kind of tell that from the way that it goes from like kind of a storyteller mode to a little bit more informative. So I can tell that you have a lot of you're well versed in a lot of different things that you've probably read to contribute to that as well.
Thank you. That's nice.
You said you would write maybe from 6 to 6:15. So did you write a lot in those little tiny spurts or chunks?
Yeah, so I would write in tiny chunks. I would also do a lot of, I have a dog and we live in New York City, so I walk a lot with her. And I would come up with a whole paragraph in my head as I walked.
Yes.
And as I sat down, I would put everything down.
Yes.
I carried, a lot of writers do this, and they probably tell you, but I carried a little notepad to just jot down an idea or a paragraph or a phrase that I would come across. I think artists also do this. They carry little pads to draw things and doodle. It's just one of those things that you want to continuously practice. And the more props you have to help you get there faster, the better off you are. I'm a really morning person, so if I could start before 6 o'clock, that would be ideal when it's totally quiet and just a certain amount of time. I also, when push came to shove and I knew that the book had to go out, I also started thinking about it in the context of what needed to get accomplished. So if a chapter needed to be reread and I needed to put my editor's notes in, I would say this task needs to get done today and I can't do anything else but that. There was also substantial research that went on for writing the book. So a lot of time was spent on just taking notes about what I was going to take away from it and how I was going to weave it into the structure of the story.
Did you have a particular place that was very inspiring where you would write?
My head.
I very much believe in the power of writing in your head before you put it on paper. I think some folks think that you have to just work on paper all the time, but I'm a very much believer in put it in your head first. Write it all out in your head first and then put it on paper. So
and then I would just have internal dialogue about it. And I think other people do too. You think through and you think, well, that's not a great idea at all. Why would anybody? And I had to, because the book was not for adults, I had to also think about what life was going to be like if I'm a child and I'm reading this. How can I make this engaging so that they want to read about this? So yeah, putting yourself in the other person's shoes was something that was hard to do.
So speaking of young folks, we're both, you know, Iranian immigrants. We've been here since we were kids. What is your advice for first generation young adults straddling those lines of Persian and American culture, or like Persian and any other hyphenated culture that they're kind of experiencing?
Yeah, so I'm Iranian by birth and I'm American by citizenship, and I feel like one doesn't have to be one or the other, right? It's a balance of finding out who you are as you get older and you think through what is the right mix of your identities and your experiences. I would say, embrace where you come from and embrace where you live, right? And be active, be a part of your community, and try to be helpful and inspiring to yourself and to those around you. I think that our Iranian ness or our experiences are inspiring for ourselves. I certainly think that, I think it's really fascinating to have seen my parents, who were a little bit younger than me, when they moved to a brand new country and they started all over again. And when I was around their age, when they came here, I thought, would I have been able to do that, right? So I think that's a unique thing about my experience. Starting all over again is thousands of years old, right? So I'm not the only one who's experienced it, but at the same time, it also makes me unique. And I've embraced the idea of starting all over again. And what is that like? And many of us have also experienced that. So I think appreciating things that make us different and appreciating things that drive us to become successful and inspiring and helpful to others, I think those should be embraced. And our language and our history should live with us and passed on, hopefully, generations.
Yes, 100%. Someone asked if this book is available in Farsi. Is there any plans for that in the future?
Oh, I wish. That is something that I have been thinking about. The book just came out at the end of September, so I haven't thought about translations, but I really do want the next level or the next edition to be a translation in Farsi. And thank you for bringing it up to my attention again.
Sure, there's lots of folks in Iran who would love to read this in the language, so that's beautiful. Okay, so imagine that you are your younger self and you see a copy of this book just sitting on a shelf in a bookstore or a library or in your classroom even. How do you think that would have impacted you or affected your life, rather than now being the author of this book?
It's hard to imagine yourself, right, as a 12-year-old, knowing all that you know as a 40-some-year-old woman. So it's hard to know how I would have reacted, but I think I would have loved it if I had seen a book that said roots in Iran as a 12-year-old, having just come from Iran. Yeah. I would have said, oh, who are these other people and what do they do? And what, let's read about them. Mm-hmm. So I think I would have been inspired and I would have loved it. And I hope that that's the case. That's what I take. That's what the young people are taking away from the book now. But not just only Iranian or children from Iranian ancestry who have grandparents or parents who are Iranian, also just other children who come from different places, right? Or even had grown up in the United States all of their lives with parents who had grown up in the United States in their lives. Just thinking about how our challenges and the obstacles we face are universal, and the themes of perseverance are also universal, and how did women in particular from this particular country overcame the barriers they faced that were maybe unique to them at the time. So I certainly hope that that's what happens. And in that we come back and we celebrate where we came from, and we are proud of who we are and where we come from, and that we don't have anything to hide about it. So, especially when we're acclimating and assimilating into new places.
Yeah, and especially when a lot of the stories that are about us or our people are often in a more negative light, or more,
Right.
To see like these powerful stories of trailblazers and visionaries, I think is just not just impactful for Iranian youth, but also just to share the stories with lots of other people and give a different perspective.
Yeah, and actually that's a really interesting point you just made, because I told you I had many writing critique groups, and one of the groups was a group of New York writers, and we were reading Anousheh Ansari's chapter, and I remember one woman said, "Wow, I had no idea that a woman like this could come from Iran," and I was so heartened that she said that, because I was like, oh my God, this is why I'm writing this book, because I wanted you to tell me that you were fascinated and surprised, pleasantly surprised that we are here. So that was really the icing on the cake that solidified why this book had to go out.
I'm just like really pumped and excited about just the range of like awesome women authors, like Iranian authors in particular, that like right now I feel like it's just been like a boom of, and we've done, NIAC's done a bunch of book talks with authors, which is so cool. I think that we're seeing this kind of like renaissance of, or like Iranian women who are writing stories that are about us and about our culture and about our history and about like just our experiences. I think is so beautiful, and I'm just so glad to be a part of this like like age right now where that's happening. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it's like this surge of creativity that I'm really excited about. That is like really has come to my attention in the past decade, and it was percolating before, but now it's really risen, and it's really exciting to see.
Is there any book in particular that you remember reading and feeling like, oh, I feel represented right now? Off the top of your head, this is a brand new question that I just made up right now, but is there anything that you can think of that made you feel like, oh man, like this
from Iranian American writers,
Middle Eastern, or anything that's like kind of like connected to your experiences?
And I wish I had her book on my shelf. It's in my bookshelf in another room. There is a book I read something like 3 or 4 years ago. I think her first name is Atuse, and her last name escapes me. And she wrote this really interesting book on, it was a story about this woman who wants to sleep for a year. She falls asleep. It's a fiction story. She herself is an Iranian American writer, but the story is not like of a particular. Oh, there she is. There. Otesae Moshfegh. Yes. And I wish I knew the name of the book. If you know it, please drop it. But I read her book. Her book was the last one. Yes, that's it. My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Thank you. So she's the one whose book I read last, and I love her storytelling. And it was fascinating how she made such a simple concept so intriguing and captivating, and I couldn't put the book down. I read it in the whole weekend. I didn't want to stop. So again, like the surge of creativity from these phenomenal women, and I love it.
I absolutely love it. I think for me it was Funny in Farsi was the first book that I was like, what? There's like more people like me. That's so cool.
Yes. And so many, my children are, my son is in high school and my daughter is in middle school, but so many of their friends have been reading Persepolis in their public school. And I love that. And I mean, Persepolis came out long after I had finished high school, but I thought that was really an interesting book, especially for college and middle school students to read. And I know it's being also read at the collegiate level, but I think that's great. And I think the form that she uses is really captivating.
Yeah, absolutely. Very like all the graphic novel style and
Yeah.
very cool. I see that Miriam just dropped for us in the chat too some of the other recordings of other awesome Iranian women authors. So if you all want to check those out, you definitely should.
Oh, wonderful.
Special shout out to Perfectly Parveen, one of my absolute new favorite books too. So
Yeah.
very cool. Okay, so what do you recommend people do after they read your book? What should they read next, or what should they do next? What would you suggest?
So that's really interesting. So one of the things that I tell my children, and I don't know how many young people there are in the audience, but I tell my children to have a journal, a journal for all the books they read as they're reading it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I would suggest, if you don't do that already, if folks don't do that already, especially if you're a young person, to have a journal and to write down your thoughts as you're reading the book. And once you finish the book, go back to your notes and read through what you were thinking about as you were going through the journey, and jot down at the end, what did you get from it and what do you want to learn from it. So that's the overarching recommendation I have for just like reading books and how to build on what you've read and how to continue to be inspired. For my book, I think back and sit and see what resonates with you. As you and I mentioned, we have awesome women from really diverse backgrounds, right? There's scientists and there's astronauts and athletes and activists and artists, right? They've done exceptionally well in their fields. Yeah. And see what inspires you. What do you want to do next? Do you want to be a woman who wants to go into the STEM fields? Do you want to be a mathematician? Do you want to pursue the arts? And think about, well, who else is doing these things and what kind of classes do I need to take to better myself? Yeah. And learn from them, and hopefully that will be a launch pad for what you want to do next in terms of studying and whatnot. Mm-hmm. The other thing that I hope that people take away from it is learning how to read people in history with a broader lens and a broader frame. I think when we think about exceptional people in history, we look at them from a narrow lens of 2020 vision, and we think, oh, they should have done more, they could have done more, they should have done they did all of these things wrong. Yeah. And I think we have to think about people in the complexities of the worlds they are navigating, just like these women had many complex worlds that they had to navigate, and no answer was going to be or is ever black and white. So think about the grays of the world as you think about exceptional people and the things they've done. Yeah. And think about, when you think more about reading about exceptional people, don't think about the actual achievement. Think about how they got there, because it's a topsy-turvy world. And it's really difficult, and it can be uninspiring, and you're going to get gaslighted, and the doors will slam. And think about, what does it take to achieve and to persevere and see the other side of the hill? So when you read about other people, think about that frame of mind. And I'm hoping that this book will inspire people to think in those terms.
Yeah. I just appreciate the fact that like there are so many visionaries and like trailblazers, and also like I hope that sometime in our lifetime that stops, so that people can just like, not have to be the first blank to do blank, like we could just and like everyone's had all these ranges of experiences, and it's not so revolutionary to be the first Iranian woman on the moon or whatever it is. Like just do it, because we all have access to it. I think is so important.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like there's been the field has been tilled enough, right? We've like sown enough seeds in the field, and I'm hoping that now we can see the flowers blooming and blossoming.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
We just have to make sure that we feed the soil.
Yes, continuously. Also, great reading strategy. I think that you or some point in your life have been a teacher, or maybe in a past life, because Yes, absolutely.
Just a
Always
moment, just
take
a moment.
notes. Always take notes while you're reading and think about what
Yeah.
you learned at the end. So yes, that is a reading strategy. Thank you for that.
Oh, I guess you're right. It is a writing strategy. I learned it from Pamela Paul, who used to do the New York Times book reviews. She's no longer there, but she gave me the idea of keeping a writing journal because she has her teenage sons also do the same thing. And I thought, what a great experience. And you can just have books and books of journals for books you read.
Yeah.
Uh,
Very cool. Okay, so are you planning on writing any more books, any new books? Are you?
I am planning on writing more books. Thank you. Because once you write, the creativity just keeps coming. So during the pandemic, I co-wrote a graphic novel about herd immunity and civic participation.
What?
And yes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. I co-wrote it with a microbiologist friend of mine, and I'm hoping that we can get some feedback from my agent very, very soon and think about the next steps. As I'm waiting to figure out where that manuscript will go, I'm also doing some research. And this is just the research stages of another young adult book on the gendered experiences for economic and social and political disenfranchisement and marginalization. But it's also going to be framed from a young person's point of view. And that part, that's a little challenging because so much of the text and content that's out there is for older people. Mm. And I wanted to come down for a teenage audience. So making that captivating is something I'm working on.
I love that. And Karina says, me and my epidemiologist mother, there we go, I got it, would love to read that book. So that's really cool.
Yes, be on the lookout. I mean, of course, the writing process and publishing books is a long process, but I certainly hope that there's definitely room for a book on civic participation and herd immunity. And it's wrapped in a really, I don't want to give away the story, but I'll tell you anyway. It's
tell us all the secrets.
It's a story wrapped inside a pandemic to make it to resonate, but it has all of these elements about how herd immunity is about civic participation and civic responsibility and the responsibilities we have to each other in our community. So we put that in a fictitious story in a graphic novel form so that younger people can be really interested in reading the story, but it's also peppered in with a lot of really heavy, awesome science, which I think there's a dearth of, especially in middle school. Like middle school science education is not really accessible to a lot of students, and we wanted the book to do that, to be accessible. I think of books and book writing as an egalitarian exercise and opportunity. So this book, whether it was this Roots in Iran or our herd immunity book, it's kind of giving access to people and experiences that they wouldn't have otherwise. So books for people.
Absolutely. I love all things access. Okay, we have a few more minutes, so I'm going to keep encouraging folks to ask more questions. Put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, actually, if you would like to ask anything from Yasmine before we are done for the evening. But while we're waiting for some more questions, I'm just going to keep asking some of my own because you're fascinating and I love talking to you.
Thank you.
So that's really cool about the graphic novel, because I feel like there's been a lot of graphic novels that are more in like the history realm and like telling stories of history through like that kind of graphic novel, like Mouse, or there's been a bunch about like, the civil rights movement, or even about hip hop and things like that. But I don't see it as much with science and stuff. So that's really cool to hear. I mean, outside of like Spider-Man, I think there's like science in Spider-Man.
Yeah.
How did you decide to like do that in a graphic novel kind of style?
So yeah, so that's really interesting. Originally, we thought about doing it in a picture book, but a picture book has really limited real estate, and we wanted to have a lot of science embedded in there. So the picture book wasn't going to do it justice. And because it was going to be heavy in science and a lot of images, we thought a graphic novel was going to be a perfect medium where people were going to read it because of just the cartoon component of it, and also be interested in the science aspect. There have been some graphic novels that capture a lot of science and science education. So we were inspired by that idea, but we haven't seen I mean, I'm very curious if any of our audience members have heard of anything like graphic novels that capture herd immunity. And herd immunity hasn't been something that has been talked about in a middle grade or young adult audience. So that became really interesting for us to go into. And as we were gathering information about what people knew about herd immunity, vaccines, and the science of developing vaccines, we wanted to find out where the misinformation was and where we can help add a little bit more light and shed light about science and the crux of science, about like how some things just are not possible to do if we just had a stronger foundation in science literacy. So we wanted to pepper that in, and we hope that both parents and children are going to read the book. We're hoping younger people are going to read the book with their parents, and middle grade and high school students would read it on their own and engage in conversation in their classrooms and with their peers.
I love that. What a great mesh of so many different things, and really bringing to life that like culturally responsive teaching and all of those great things that are such key educator moves right now. So that's awesome. Okay, we're getting some questions. What age group would you suggest this book for? I would say any age group, but was there an age group in particular that you were thinking of, like middle grades? Is that what you're kind of going for?
Yeah, any group, any age group, but I would agree with you. Anywhere between 7th through 10th or 11th grade would be good.
Okay, wonderful. But again, anyone, buy it for everybody, buy it for all.
Yeah, buy it for anybody, and read it at the dinner table by the fire. I mean, I know now it's getting warmer, but by the
at the park, at the beach, anywhere.
At the park, at the beach, yeah.
Another question: have your own children, read this book?
Yes, they have, of course. They have read it.
Like by force or by will?
I think they were initial beta readers. So I had beta readers, that's for sure. And they read it right before it came out in publication, because I wanted to make sure that there was another lens of children reading it.
Did they have for you? Did they give you any ideas of things to tweak or keep?
As beta readers, but at the very final stages, there was no feedback. I remember as beta readers, it was like, no, Mom, that doesn't sound like what a kid would be interested in reading. So that's really interesting when we write for children, it's a totally different way of thinking about language and language acquisition and language as a way to captivate an audience to continue reading on to the next sentence. And that was something that I really had to think about. And I would say that took a lot longer than any part of the other book. I mean, other parts, because I could research it and I could put it in my adult head about how to write it for an adult audience. But in order to be captivating, to have the right formula of sentences and words and difficulty in vocabulary, that was something that I needed to hone in on.
I love that. Very cool. So along kind of the same lines, but not about your kids, how many times did you have to edit your manuscript? Like after the editing, did you need to rewrite a lot of the book, or were there just mere changes here and there?
Yeah, so the manuscript was literally redone 20 times. Like a total
No wonder it took 4 years.
And only, I mean, because like I would come up with a structure, I would put it together in a narrative form, and then I would realize this isn't going to work, and then it had to be done again. And then there was also just like minor edits. So, you know, that was done constantly up until it went to the printing house. It was being edited, and words were taken out and replaced, and tense was looked at more carefully. So it was a constant, I don't want to say battle, but it was definitely a constant stream of work for the editing components. But there was, in terms of process, I would write and then I would stop and I wouldn't look at what I had written for at least 24 hours. And then I would come back and then I would realize, oh, these sentences cannot be here. And one of the things that we tell our young, educators tell younger people to do this, but I did this all the time. I had to read it out loud to make sure that it made sense. And I would have a draft of a paragraph or a section or a chapter that I would love for 3 or 4 weeks. And I would think, oh, this is for sure going to go in the book. And I would read it out loud and I would realize that so much of it had to come out and be drafted because the flow wasn't there, especially for a young audience. So this is part of writing, and you just have to be, and my advice is be patient with yourself and be kind to yourself.
It's so hard. It's so hard.
I know that it's really hard. But if you find something that will anchor you, inspiration, you're going to find a way to do it, which is what happened, right? Like a book on civic participation and herd immunity is fascinating to me, and I know that it belongs in the world. Roots in Iran belongs to the world and to readers, right? So if you find things that you're inspired by, it makes it easier.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I go by the pseudonym of One Draft Shadi. So knowing that as a writer, I think that's what's kept me from starting my writing process. Is like knowing that I'm gonna have to like keep doing it over and over. It's so intimidating, but I really appreciate that advice. So okay, so let's see. I have a couple more questions. First of all, Cyrus here in the audience, Cyrus, if you were in my class right now, you get a bunch of points because love all the questions you're sharing with us. We have a question about what is your recommendation on introducing young Iranians or Americans or both, Iranian Americans, to our culture?
Excuse me. Well, first, if you are living in a place where there are a lot of Iranian Americans, I think going to restaurants, going to libraries, going to festivals and concerts is definitely a great way to learn about your culture and heritage. I also know that there are many Farsi teaching schools peppered around the country. So if you can enroll in those schools, I would definitely encourage you to do so. And if you're too old to enroll in them, if you don't have the time to enroll in them, find people in that community where you can come together and play together and cook Iranian food or make desserts together and watch movies, frankly, right? So those are just some of the things that you can be engaged in. And I love these book talks, right? Like having these cultural exchanges, going to museums whenever they promote Iranian events or cultural events, go to them and support them.
Yeah.
Going and supporting our, I don't want to say our people, but I will say it, in different venues, not only shows that there is definitely an interest, but it also attracts interest from others too. So the more people know about Iranians, Iranian culture and history, the less difficult it is for us to try to explain, who are we, where do we come from, and what are our values and what motivates us.
I love that. Yes, always starting at the surface level and then going deeper and deeper.
Yeah, definitely.
And food is always the place to start, right? I think that's how we always get introduced to
Books,
cultures.
food, books, dance, music.
I love it. Okay, so as we're wrapping up, Women's Her Story Month, right? The last day of the month. What is your little soundbite for the women who are listening, or for that will listen, all of the women out there? What is your little phrase that you want to share with them? Your inspirational phrase.
My inspirational phrase is one of the phrases that I quote in the book from Khalil Gibran, which I really love and which kind of brought me to writing this book. And I want to say it because I don't want to paraphrase it, because I worry about messing it up, but now I can't find it. So I'll paraphrase it to the best of my abilities. But the quote is, we are not limited by our abilities, but by our vision. So I would say, let that be your guiding light. Don't let the things that you think won't stop you get in the way. You have a vision of a bigger version of yourself.
That's so beautiful. Yay. Thank you so much, Yasmine, for spending some time with me tonight. For everyone who joined us, I'm so honored. Lily, take it away.
That was amazing. Hearing about those stories and getting to understand it from an outside perspective was really so enlightening. I'm definitely going to buy your book for my mom and my sister so they can read it as well. Yasmine, thank you so much for joining tonight and sharing your thoughts with us as a way to cap off Women's History Month. We really, really appreciate you for being here with us and answering all of our questions and just giving us insight into the process of writing your book. I would also love to thank Shadi as well for moderating tonight's event. And once again, to everyone watching, thank you for joining us tonight. And I hope you all have a great evening and happy Eid.
Yay.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.